if you have this situation where you have these people putting into place policies that are deeply unpopular. Trump's popularity is really in really dire straits. He's underwater, meaning more people disapprove than approve of virtually everything he's doing, and including on the shutdown. 78% of Americans do want what the Democrats want, which is the extension of the premium tax credits to make sure that the Affordable Care Act markets don't collapse, which, the Republicans, again, that's part of what Vote wants. He has said that he wants to get rid of the Affordable Care Act. That's something that the Republicans have really pushed for a long time, but that's really, really unpopular. So if that's the case, what happens? Well, I think you can see what is happening in the White House with certainly Russell Vogt appears to be continuing to slash everything he can, but Stephen Miller appears to be the person calling the shots for the use of the military domestically and also against the Venezuelan boats in the Caribbean, four of them now, with the death of at least 17 people, which the New York City Bar Association yesterday came out and called murder. And he seems to me to be increasingly unhappy, concerned about the pushback that the administration is getting, because the administration, as I say, is extraordinarily unpopular. So he has become the face of the administration out there talking about how those people who are standing up against Trump and against the policies of the administration are committing insurrection. Now, interestingly enough, over the weekend, when the administration was making noises about sending federalized National Guard troops into, or either federalizing the National Guard troops in Oregon or sending federalized National Guard. No, I'm sorry, let me put it differently. They were going to federalize National Guard troops in Oregon, and Oregon lawyers, both at the state and the city level, tried to get a restraining order against that happening, or an injunction against that happening. Um, the person who heard the case was a Trump appointee. She was a judge, is a judge who named Immergut, last name Immergut, who was appointed by Trump. And she said she took a look at what was actually happening on the ground in Portland, Oregon, and said, there's no problem here. There's really, literally, the government says you need to have troops there because last July someone threw rocks at law enforcement officers, but the law enforcement officers in Portland took care of that. So we don't. You have no excuse for federalizing the National Guard troops in Portland. So within hours, the administration tried to federalize California National Guard troops and send them in. So at that point, the governor of California and Portland, Oregon, and the state of Oregon all got together and said, hey, wait a minute, let's get back here. You can't do this. And once again, she said, no, you can't. And you're not allowed to send in anybody for 14 days while we hash this all out. Well, Stephen Miller got out in front of the cameras and called what she, a Trump appointee, said legal insurrection. Now, one of the things that you've seen for the last several days is the repeated use of the word insurrection and of reporters asking Trump if he is going to invoke the Insurrection Act. And I'm really interested in that because a number of people have written to me and said Trump says he's talking about the Insurrection Act. And that may be the case. I confess I've been doing a lot of other stuff, so I haven't watched every single thing Trump has said lately. He hasn't been out there all that much. But what I'm hearing is reporters asking him about it and him answering, not him saying, I'm going to do this, but him answering in that sort of, oh, no, I'll look into it kind of way he's been doing, which makes me wonder who is asking? Like, why are they asking? Like, are they being set up to ask? Because it's pretty clear that Trump really doesn't know if he's a foot or horseback. So the more he hears from the news, the more he sees in these videos that that the Department of Homeland Security is making. And by the way, the Department of Homeland Security has been running a white nationalist account on social media, which is very clearly white nationalist. So, and Kristi Noem appears to be working pretty closely with Stephen Miller. Kristi Noem is the Secretary of Homeland Security. So he's talking a lot about the Insurrection Act. Well, why? One of the things that Miller has tried to set up is the idea that anybody who disagrees with anything the Trump administration is doing is fighting against the government, is an insurrectionist against the government, especially in places like Chicago and Portland, where, again, in Portland, every city has a crime. For the record, I live in the country. The country has crime too. Nobody ever pays a lot of attention to rural crime, because somehow, I don't know. I guess it's got this longstanding idea that there isn't crime here. But believe me, there's plenty of crime here. Probably statistically, in terms of numbers, higher than in cities. I think that's right, actually. That was a rabbit hole I didn't mean to go down. But certainly there's crime everywhere, but the idea that there is a war zone or war ravaged Portland, as Trump has called it, is simply a fantasy. I mean, that's just simply not the case. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute. And so why would anybody be trying to argue that we need to send in troops to places where there's literally no need for them? And one of the things that is important to hold in mind in this moment is that anybody who studies um, war strategy will tell you that you do not want to invade. If you invade territory, you're going to create local hostility. And you can see this dramatically in the Civil War. You think about the Confederates coming into Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. The two times that the Confederacy really managed in a significant way to invade the North, they get hammered and pushed back. Because when you have an invading army, people tend to fight against it. It certainly looks as if the administration is trying to incite aggression against federal troops with the idea that that will create a cause for um, invoking the Insurrection Act. Now, let me explain to you what the Insurrection Act is. I have talked before about how in 1878, Congress passes the Posse Comitatus Act, one of my favorite acts in American history, actually, because really quickly, after the 1876 election, when Rutherford B. Hayes almost doesn't win, he loses in the popular vote, and it comes down to the Electoral College. And then there's a deal cut in the South for the electoral votes of 3 states. There's a 4th state in the West nobody ever pays attention to. But of those 3 states, one of the deals that is cut by a railroad baron is that if the leaders of those states agree to stop resisting the inauguration of Rutherford B. Hayes, that the Hayes administration will make sure that there will be money coming into railroads in those states. And then that happened. They agree. Rutherford B. Hayes takes office in March of 1877. And then in July 1877, there's a massive railroad strike. It's our first really national strike. And the Great Railroad Strike starts in the same railroad line as the guy who did the deal for Rutherford B. Hayes. And when that happens, the Democrats in Congress are beside themselves, not least because many of the railroad workers are Democrats, but also because it certainly looks as if this railroad baron has put in place in the White House a guy who's going to use the military for the railroad baron's bidding. And so in 1878, when after the railroad strike and after the election of Hayes, which was deeply contested, the Democrats take control of the House and the Senate. And when they do that, they get the Posse Comitatus Act, which says that the government cannot use the federal troops against U.S. civilians to enforce the law. Little tiny rabbit hole, because this is important, and I think it's nobody ever talks about it. Posse Comitatus Act is actually really important for stopping the military from being used in the way that Rutherford B. Hayes used it in 77, but it also really destroys indigenous communities, because the only people in the American plains who could effectively keep settlers from stealing stealing stuff from indigenous Americans, horses and household goods, for example, but especially from intruding on their grazing rights, which are really what's valuable in the United States, in the plains in the 1880s and the 1890s, is the US Army, and the US Army can no longer do that. We get the rise of indigenous police, but it's much harder for indigenous police to keep out the cattle herds, for example, that are pushing into indigenous land. I don't know, little addendum there to the larger question of what Posse Comitatus was about. But, sometimes people forget how important indigenous history is to the rest of our history. Okay, I'll stop and get back to today. Anyway, that's the Posse Comitatus Act. But there was an act signed by Thomas Jefferson in 1807 called the Insurrection Act. And the Insurrection Act says that the federal government can call out troops in three different cases, one of which is if there is an insurrection against the government. And that's been used repeatedly throughout our history. I think the last time it was used was by George W. Bush during the Rodney King riots in LA. In that case, the Democratic governor and the Democratic leader of LA requested those be sent. But the government can call out the troops in case of an insurrection. And it has done so against the wishes of a governor in a state a number of times, at least two major times that I can think of. So, what seems to be going on here is it looks as if people, and I'm not going to identify them, although I think you can see which direction I'm going, are trying to goad Trump into declaring that there is an insurrection against the government in the United States. And what that does then is it essentially creates martial law. Now, you can see today, a lot of you asked about this. Stephen Miller was doing an interview, and somebody asked about his claim that the Trump appointed judge was committing legal insurrection. And he did his usual sort of cascade of an argument. And just so you know, when he says, as you know, we won this, he's wrong about that stuff. He's saying stuff that is flat out not true, with the idea that he's going to create this world that people will believe in. Anyway, then he said, as it's clear in the 10th Title 10 of the Judicial Code, which is the Insurrection Act, the president has plenary authority. And then he kind of stopped. Like people, the interviewer sort of said, "Is this a technical difficulty?" But Miller's eyes were still moving. He just stopped talking. Now I don't know what happened there. Lots of people are making assumptions about why he did what he did. Who knows? But I want to call something out there that I haven't seen somebody call out yet. And that is, first of all, plenary power says the president can do anything he wants. And that is not the case. That's Miller being Miller. But one of the things that a number of people on the radical right have really focused on in the last several years are the writings of a political philosopher, political scientist, really, although they weren't really called that then, from Germany, who became a Nazi during World War II. And his name is Carl Schmitt. And what he argued is that in a liberal democracy, there are exceptions to the rules, the written rules, and it's those exceptions that prove really where true power is. And when you can find those exceptions, the person who takes advantage of those exceptions and can take advantage of those exceptions is where the power resides. And saying that the president has plenary power under Title 10 of the Judicial Code essentially says the United States has a dictator. Now, I want people to understand that, because that is 1,000% not how our system works. This is the attempt of a man who is watching power slide away, because for all that the administration is grabbing as much power as it possibly can, it is doing so as it is extremely unpopular. Most dictators grab power when they are very popular, so there aren't a lot of people to speak up against them. In this case, the vast majority of Americans do not like what is going on. So they're trying to just tell people that they're in power and hoping that people will go along with it. All right. So what does this mean going forward? Things are going to be extremely unsettled going forward. But somebody asked, which I think is a great question, how do we show that this is all manufactured? That in fact, the administration is trying to manufacture the idea that we are in a war, to give them cover to send in troops, to drive protesters into situations where there will be a conflagration, and then to invoke the Insurrection Act because of that. And by the way, you can see things like that in what happened in Chicago on Saturday morning. Important lesson in that. There was a shooting in Chicago at something that appeared to be protest related Saturday morning. And if you watched the reports of that, many media outlets ran with the story that the Department of Homeland Security got there out there instantly, that 10 cars had rammed um, federal vehicles, and that somebody had brandished a weapon at a semi-automatic, I believe it was called, weapon at an officer who had then fired at the person. And all of those outlets said, we can't confirm this, but they also ran that story. And this is one of the reasons you want to wait and see what happens, because in court yesterday, the defendant for the person who was shot said, and again, we have not seen this in a court yet. We haven't seen this hammered out, but said there is a body cam that shows just the opposite, that in fact protesters had been following these vehicles for a number of miles. One of the vehicles slammed into the vehicle of the person who ends up getting shot, approached the person and said, something including an expletive, sort of attacked them, and then opened fire without any weapons being brandished or anything, and shot the person 5 times. Now that person miraculously appears to have survived in decent shape, but the picture here that we saw was DHS trying to suggest that there was this huge violence on the part of the protesters. In fact, it appears from what was testified to in court or introduced in court by a lawyer, that in fact there's a body cam that shows that that was a completely made up story. So what do you do in this moment? So one of the things that I would urge you to do is first of all to stay nonviolent. I mean, that's so important in this moment, but constantly to record the nonviolence, if you will, to keep on social media. This is not what is happening. I thought the images that have been all over the social media in the last 2 days of the protester in Portland who was dressed as a frog were incredibly powerful, because it's really hard to argue that the protesters are, threatening the life of an ICE officer when literally the protester is dressed as a frog, as this big poofy frog. Having those images on social media is going to make it harder and harder to convince the majority of Americans that we truly are at war. This is where our superpower resides, is to make sure that we show Americans and the world that the violence is coming from the federal government, not from the protesters against it, and to make sure that's everywhere. Because what really is going to matter going forward is where I started. That is, remember I said power has been sloshing around, and right now I am still gobsmacked that the Senate Republicans don't seem to want to pick up their power, regardless of partisanship or anything else. That is literally what they swore an oath to do. But if power is sloshing around, there are 341 million of us in this country who would like a piece of it. And us taking back our power and reminding people that this is our government and not that of unelected, appointed officials who are advancing ideologies that we do not share. This is our moment to grab that power back and to insist on it. And you can see it starting to get teeth. You can see it in places that the administration is backing down. You can see it. Democrats in Congress are getting a bad rap because it's very hard for them as a minority party to make a huge difference, but they are pushing back. They're holding hearings. They're slowing down the Republicans. They're out there in front of the airwaves every day. And the Republicans have simply left town until October 14th in the middle of a shutdown. The more we hammer on the dereliction of duty coming from elected Republicans, the more and the true pain that's going to be caused by the cuts they've made, by the deportations and the detentions, which it troubles me desperately that one of the things that this administration has done extremely effectively is obfuscation. They're moving people around so nobody knows where they are. Their lawyers can't get to them. It's very hard for journalists to report. There's a law that says that Congress is supposed to go and be able to examine what's happening in detention centers. And the Republican leaders are simply saying, no, 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 we're not doing that anymore. So that invisibility of the conditions in detention centers, which we know from reports from the government themselves, are desperately substandard, violating codes and so on. That's a real problem. And the more we can call attention to that, the more we have a chance of grabbing our power back. Because really, you must remember that we are on a knife edge between those people who are trying to create a dictatorship to do things like, as a senator said today, purify the country. And I promise you, when a lawmaker starts to talk about purifying a country, nothing good is going to come from it. It never does, unless I guess they're talking about our waters. I can live with that. But he was talking about people. They want to grab power to create this fantasy world of theirs based on an ideology. And I promise you that there is never an ideology that you force people into that is going to serve a democracy. The only ideology that serves a democracy is one that upholds a multicultural democracy, like we have striven to have in this country. Otherwise, you're trying to make people fit the ideology, not the ideology fit the people. And you end up hurting people very badly at the very least. So, in this moment, using our ability to call attention to the fact that that Stephen Miller and the people around the president are living in a fantasy world is incredibly important.